to them and you more about this.
So let's go ahead and bring on Lawrence. I'm just going to read the introduction real quick. Lawrence Leck is a London-based artist, filmmaker, and musician who unifies diverse practices, CGI, audiovisual performance, gaming, and fiction into a continuously expanding cinematic universe. His works include the CGI film Idol, the open world video game 2065, the AI coming-of-age story Geomancer, and the video essay Sino-Futurism, and Notel, a simulation of a fully automated luxury hotel in collaboration with Code 9. Leck composes soundtracks and conducts live audio-visual mixes of his works, often incorporating playthroughs of his virtual worlds. And we have a special playthrough for you today as part of this, so we're really excited for that. His most recent release is Temple OST, the soundtrack to a site-specific installation at 180 The Strand in London. Recent exhibitions include a major survey exhibition of the artist's work titled Farsight Freeport at HEC, House of Electronic Arts in Basel, Idol at Sadie Coles in London, that was a big solo show recently, and K11 Art Space, Hong Kong, and PlayStation at Night and the Whitechapel Gallery, London. So here he comes. Let's bring on Lawrence. Hey, Lawrence.
Hey, how you doing? From London. Hi, Zyba.
Hey, I'm glad someone else is on my time. Like,
I know. I was so paranoid. I was like getting the time zone wrong, so I kept on Googling like time in California now.
Oh, it's nice to see you.
Yeah. I also connected with Lawrence that same trip to London, actually, in the real world for the first time. And I met Lawrence, and he had an installation. You had that installation in a bar. It was sort of like adjacent to a pounding dance club, which I loved so much. Seeing a video game in that environment, like I was just immediately drawn into the simulation.
Back in those ancient days,
yeah,
with parties and stuff.
No, but I think like, yeah, how work reaches people is a really important part of the conversation that we're going to have today. And so much of your work focuses around, or the way your work does reach audiences is sort of modeled after the distribution of the video game industry. So we're going to kind of get into that a little bit later on. But first, if you could just tell us a bit about your selections for us today, because you've prepared this sort of amazing walkthrough for us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was a little bit conscious that it's, I mean, first of all, I think it's great that we have this really custom-made live platform, but it's a surreal experience presenting work not live and also not quite online. So I wanted to give like people watching a sense of the kind of what I'm interested in. So maybe the way I can best explain it is like, I have a huge interest in lots of different art forms. So like, you know, my journey is basically as like to art is through like architecture, architectural design, electronic music, and eventually into like, you know, the kind of museum and gallery world. But I still do as much like film and music stuff as I can on the side. And one thing I really loved is, you know, I started being a musician back in the days of MySpace. So obviously, you know, it's a social network that is completely dissolved. And not just that, but I think 2 years ago, they like changed their database and lost all the music that was on there. So it really just reminds me that, you know, these virtual worlds like act as a different kind of memory, as a different form of memory. So, you know, for example, now like whatever, like retro gaming or like retro technology, skeuomorphic design is really part of contemporary like culture. But the two works that I'm showing, to cut to the point, 2065 and Temple OST, are about simulations of these spaces where I have had exhibitions. So about 5 years ago, when I was doing lots of really like site-specific, actually architectural stuff primarily, I really realized that the more that you do a project specifically for, let's say, an exhibition or an event or a biennial or whatever, the faster it fades from memory, which is really kind of a strange paradox. You know, you put in so much effort to like fabricating this artwork, this sculpture, this space, and then the next day it's just taken apart. Then I thought, actually, it's so weird that the video game virtual world actually has a longer lifespan than the whole physical artifact, which is completely had a completely different value system to what I guess I was kind of taught to believe. I suppose like in architecture, you always see the CGI rendering or the blueprint as something that serves, it's just part of the process that creates the final thing, which is the building. So I thought, like, what if you just took that simulation, that CGI rendering, that artist's impression, and took that as the final thing itself? And in doing so, it would kind of free you up from many different things, like obviously like money, property speculation, and so on. But you could really think about injecting utopian ideas into these works. So anyway, briefly, 2065 is an open world video game that is set in the year 2065 in Singapore. Singapore is a post-colonial island nation that was independent in 1965. So 2065 is the centennial, basically, of the independence of the nation state. So as you probably know, and a lot of ideology about Singapore is very cast in this like neoliberal dream state vibe. I mean, with the same implications of, William Gibson's Wired essay, Disneyland with the Death Penalty, which was commissioned actually for Wired magazine in one of their first, I think even their first year of publication, I think in 1993. And William Gibson goes to Singapore in 1993, which is actually when I was still living there. And he basically places it as this, Disneyland as with the death penalty says it all, which really casts, how should I say, when I reread it now, actually what seems like with all the stuff going on, and it actually very like prejudiced and privileged light over this Southeast Asian nation. And part of what I was thinking with that, why set it in Singapore, is even though it's set as a kind of contemporary setting for like this utopian control state, because of course they have a lot of like smart city design going on there right now, the kind of is very authoritarian and so on, and especially with surveillance and coronavirus. It basically was surprising for me to like reread this Disneyland with the Death Penalty essay about 25 years after it's published. So I set 2065 in Singapore to kind of play with these ideas that aren't so explicit, but talk about this environment that's like, fully technology. In a way, it's like the kind of Silicon Valley dream, right? It's like total control, total data of everything, a seemingly compliant population to give up privacy and data and so on. But at the same time, I was asking myself, like, what culture could emerge from that? So in 2065, the game, it's rendered from the point of view of an AI who has been made by Farsight Corporation, who's a AI company, fictional AI company, in order to make a game. So it's kind of like this Hall of Mirrors effect. It's a game about an AI commissioned with making a game about the country that they live within. And the next work, which is Temple OST, it's an installation about a Farsight's club space, actually. So as you might know, like many other industries, media industries, music is very susceptible to algorithmic control and distribution. I mean, earlier I was talking about MySpace, and of course, for those old enough to remember, there was debates in the late 90s, Napster, streaming, torrenting, that has all become, SoundCloud, Spotify, and this different ecosystem, where previously, growing up playing guitar or whatever and being in bands, you think that, the music is at the center. And of course, now it's a data point in a trend, essentially. So Temple OST is about a disused nightclub that is empty and evacuated. And it's based on a physical exhibition, but I also wanted it to be something that had an afterlife after the exhibition as well. So it's as much about like nostalgia and memory as about like a kind of celebration of enjoyment and I guess a kind of more hedonistic or free lifestyle. So those are the two works.
Cool. I think with that, I'd love to just cut to the playthrough. Yeah. And we'll chat a little bit more afterwards. Cool.
See you there.
a fight to pass the time along. He's got a little gramophone that plays his song. Take me back to dear old Blimey. Somewhere, so brave, having a shave, trying to part his hair. Mickey yelled, dodging the shells and lumps of dynamite. Talk of the Crystal Palace on a firework night. Take me back to dear old Blighty. Put me on the train for London town. Take me over there. Drop me anywhere. Birmingham, Leeds or Manchester, well I don't care. I just love to see my best girl cuddling up again with them to be. Diddly, diddly, I-dee, hurry me back to Blighty. Blighty is the place for me.
在2065年，远见公司发掘出如何利用人工智能的力量。街道上空无一人，无人再踏上旅程，只因虚拟比现实更真实。算法已代替了所有的工作，人们与人工智能在网络游戏中日夜对战。他们甚至不用作弊，因为人工智能总让人类获胜。电子竞技是全球发展速度最快的行业，政客们称之为瘾，玩家们称之为演化。拒绝在电子竞技奥运会上认输后，一对游戏机器人脱离了远见。这些人工智能对所有游戏都已操纵自如。如今，他们想成为艺术家，宣称自己为中华未来主义者，以发布名为2065的电子游戏来建立他们的运动。这些华为家声称这是一件艺术品，一个没有英雄、没有敌人、没有赢家、没有输家的游戏。 望世界中探索，这是反映玩家心智的一面镜子。在2065中，有人能分辨出艺术与世界之间的不同吗？有些人可以立即察觉到，但有些人会需要久一点。每个玩家都始于同个初衷，他们都想置身异界。不清楚，是因为无人停止玩耍，除了我们。
You are standing in the desert. During daytime, bathed in the harsh light of the sun, dunes stretch out in front of you. In the center is a familiar object. A London Underground train carriage lies on the crest of the dune, like a beached whale in the desert. It doesn't belong here, and neither do you. The train is burning up. Smoke is pouring out from the inside. Above the driver's car is the sign for the train's destination, Temple. You approach slowly, gliding, tracking towards the flames. The doors don't open. They're closed tight to keep the sand out.
When I was in my prime, I flourished like a vine. There came along a false young man, come stole the heart of mine. Come stole the
You walk
heart
around.
of mine.
No entrance, no exits.
The gardener standing by, 3 offers he made to
You see the train is in front of a station. It's Temple.
Violet and red rose, which I refused all 3. Which I
The station is abandoned but illuminated. The last person out forgot to turn off the light.
The pink's no flower at all, for it fades away too soon, and the violet is too pale a hue. I think I'll wait till June. I think I'll wait till June. In June the red rose bloomed,
video poster. A new record has been released. It spins on a loop, playing the same melody over and over again. Ahead is a neon sign. It says Farsight. You've never heard of it. Lo and behold, another construction site. The city is being built in the desert. Is the music from the video? Or is it just music in the air? A red tower crane stretches towards the sky. Steel trusses crisscrossed against each other, mutually supporting the forces of the machine that does the heavy lifting. The red light is still blinking to catch the attention of low-flying aircraft that might never come again. On your left, a burning construction vehicle. Abandoned by the worker, set alight by the sun. To come back. Is the scene one of anticipation? The sight before the building comes? Or one of demolition? The sight when the building's being torn down? It's hard to tell. Except for the Farsight sign above, now larger. Each letter 3 feet high. You wanted to get to. A dozen spotlights look for a target to bathe in attention. You go closer, hoping they'll identify you and shine bright on you. But they don't. regardless, the rhythm now part of the concrete floor. In the corner, the DJ booth. It's empty, but the DJ queued up records for the rest of the night. It's only 9 p.m. The magic hour. 7 hours left to go. Where's the other room? The one behind the camouflage netting. Where the smoke machine puffs away. Is it dry ice? Or something else burning? You can't smell anything here. So you walk on to the next room, where distant music plays. Down the corridor, the haze is so thick, you can't see your feet beneath you. You turn right. Room. Smaller than the first, but with more memories. You've been here before. At least on the screen. 4 walls of netting. Puffing away jets of haze. 7 steps illuminated by the blue neon. 3 screens telling you the story of where you just came from, over and over again. spotlight pointed straight at it. You walk up to take your place. Nobody's there. Just us.
So welcome back, everyone. And nice to see you both again, Kalani and Lawrence. And Lawrence, thank you so much for that wonderful playthrough. As a Londoner, obviously, one thing I'd just like to, I guess, first talk about is the use of the London Underground carriage. And I feel like that's a really kind of like iconic symbol of London identity. And yeah, I just love for you to kind of maybe just discuss a little bit about that for me, please.
Sure. I think first of all, like I always get reminded how generic most places are, you know, airports, cafes, cityscapes, roads, and so on. Like the whole world is, you know, like heavily standardized to be manufactured. And of course, like with the virtual worlds I'm doing, I always want it to like, there we have a siren. I want to inject some kind of fragment that is like specific to a place. So, you know, in Temple, there's like the London Underground carriages. In 2065, it's set in Singapore, but also part of that, it starts off with an exhibition of the same place in London, in another exhibition. And that had like, you know, what could, to me, I was asking myself, what is the most problematic symbol, visual symbol of what the UK was at that point, which is, you know, the Union Jack, the flag. And for those who don't know, like, I always get fascinated with digging through the history of these things, that basically the Union Jack is 3 flags in one. It's the English flag plus the Scottish flag plus the Welsh dragon. Welsh dragon isn't important, apparently, so it's just not there. And who knows with Northern Ireland. So there's these overlays of meaning into like these everyday symbols. And so with the London Underground carriage, it was like, you know, I was trying to focus on the spaces that are usually ignored, like, you know, spaces of transit, tube stations, underground traffic, construction sites that actually are kind of like universal architectural language of the city, basically. So yeah, that's kind of important to me.
Yeah, and I think that kind of sort of almost like that, it's an anchor in sort of like nomadic identity as well, which I think that really kind of is such a like concurrent like theme in all of your work, which is something I'm really fond of. And I think also it kind of comes down to also your kind of your own personal experience of moving around a lot as well, and kind of I guess that sort of like longing for place as well, but also sort of being in constant sort of motion. But yeah, so I think that was, yeah, that was
totally. I think you know, there's something like very natural in, you know, a first person game basically that has that wandering aspect. You know, you're behind the camera, or you're kind of in control of the world and where you look through as well. And it's also interesting, like this nomadic idea, because you're like a person's ability to travel is also tied to like where they have access to, quite simply, you know. And in Singapore, depending on like, obviously, basically depending on how your socioeconomic status, you're either an expat or you're an immigrant, right? There's like there's a kind of charge to like which status you have based on like your means of entry into a place. And I mean, just, yeah, and you know, so I mean, just from my experience, kind of you know, Chinese diaspora, there's so many different levels. You know, you have kind of like, at the moment, you might have like the kind of base level labor versus the kind of, how should I say? Yeah, all sorts of socioeconomic levels who might either be compelled to travel or have the ability to, you know, or have the means to travel for like leisure or choice as well. So these are all things that are like really wrapped up into just quite a simple first person perspective, basically, which is, yeah, just quite simply like one of access. And so what I'm always interested in as well is like, obviously not everyone can visit the exhibition, either they're not here, but at least some fragment of that might be able to be accessed online, even if it's through the music or the music video or something like that. So for Temple OST stands for, original soundtrack. I released the album for that earlier this year, and then I put together like, I think, music videos for all of the 7 tracks, like in order, so that the walkthrough can be seen as a whole by seeing the music videos as well. So sometimes, I'm interested in different tactics that play with the distribution of how works are shown. That are away from like a kind of Spotify or whatever kind of model.
But it's also, I think also this kind of like multifaceted or sort of like modular kind of approach to your sort of practice is about being sort of enabling different, like you said, access routes, and also it's kind of, so someone might come across your music once, but and then learn about your art afterwards. So it's like, I think it's about also something I'm kind of really interested in, this kind of idea of maximum visibility. So it's kind of like, how do you increase your your visibility when you feel invisible, or you don't feel kind of and that's, I think, also something I'm really interested in, is like how people on the margins are sort of using technology to be able to kind of like to become visible. So I think like
to be seen. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So it's like I find these are all kind of strands of your sort of web that you're kind of pulling together, which I think is really fascinating. And I know your like music is such a massive part of your practice. So yeah, I don't know if Kalani, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I have a question that I want to throw out to Lawrence, which is around the approximation of reality. And even as you were introducing 2065, you talked about, positioning it in this imagined centennial, which is sort of anchoring it to history in that sense of reality. And, I spent a lot of time with this essay, Seeing, Naming, Knowing by Nora Khan, as I was preparing for this event, and just in general. I have a really worn out copy here. I love this writing. And one of the things that Nora talks about in here is positioning technology as a simulation as a technology of power. And when, you approximate reality, people think it's reality. And so I'm curious how that sort of notion of approximation or simulation plays into your practice. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think, like the relationship obviously with conjuring up an image and power is central, I think, to the kind of political act, right? I think, ancient Greek philosophers would call it, the art of rhetoric, which is essentially, you're creating a persuasive argument so that the people in front of you have an image of their mind of some kind of like ideology or ideal society. And of course with, CGI or any kind of like rendering, in Third Reich at Leni Riefenstahl and stuff, you can create an audio-visual experience, holistic experience, to communicate your vision, basically. And the thing about this simulation is that, again, it's kind of like ethically agnostic. It's neither good nor bad, right? You could create like kind of like environmentalism, let's save the world for the future, or you could create like a kind of like xenophobic, let's kick whoever out of the country. So it's deeply problematic. I think another, and tricky. I think another thing as well is that as simulation, and by simulation, I don't just mean simulation of images, I also mean, simulation of sound, deep fake technology, deep porn, all this kind of stuff. Like it's deeply, even more problematic, not even just on the level of fake news, but on the level of like, subverting reality. That the way I think about it is that because, I'm essentially me or a few friends making these worlds, there's no, like, that is always going to lag behind the state-of-the-art photorealistic rendering or kind of deep fake, or, the production of reality that is indistinguishable from the real event or object or human being. It's interesting as, there's initiatives in video games, in, service industry technology that is to create digital humans, right? So, you know, perfectly believable virtual human beings who might respond to your queries of changing like a restaurant reservation, or might, you know, try and persuade you one way or the other. So the simulation is absolutely has like a important political aspect to it. But for me, as I guess like an artist and writer, you have the ability to choose not really even what stories to tell, but what worlds to build, you know, what level of world building you go for. And, you know, one thing that we were talking about briefly before is, you know, world building is really, for me, a very important entry point into what I do or I'm interested in. And the way I got into art, let's say, is not by accident, because I'm interested in creativity, but almost by other routes, you know, a bit of this book I like, a bit of this film, and then I grew up and I realized, oh, there's a way of making it work, kind of as you know, to pay the bills, basically, which is exciting.
Yeah. We should talk more about that in the lounges afterwards, because we were just having a lot of conversation about being practitioners in adjacent industries, video gaming and technology industries, and the decisions we make around those two kinds of practices and how they're related. I want to share a comment from the audience. Karina says, fantastic work, Lawrence. I'm so glad we were able to see 2065 and Temple in conversation with each other. And so I want to also center on these two works and talk a little bit about how they functionally perform a little bit more. We talked about the album reaching new audiences. So in 2065, I think what's really interesting is that piece, as you said, archives itself. And so every time it's exhibited, a new portion of the simulation grows to represent that exhibition. And then by contrast, right, thinking about the albums and Temple as this sort of expansion pack for your feature film. So can you talk a little bit about these different models and how you structure that? And then also getting into the discussion around the difference between first person and cinematography as your work jumps in these different formats.
Yeah. So I think for me, one of the biggest and most abstract challenges as trying to make creative work is having continuity, basically. And what I mean by that is not just keeping doing what you love for like a long period of time. What I mean by that is that somehow something about the way that work and labor gets distributed means that every art form, in my opinion, gets more and more atomized over time. So, for example, my friends, no one commissions you to make an album. You maybe make a single or a remix. Most likely, you're not going to do any of your own music because you're going to DJ at a place to provide a vibe. My friends who are writers, no one's going to commission you to write a novel or a short story. They want 750 words by Friday at 12, you know? And my friends who are CGI animators, no one's going to ask you to do like a web series for, whatever, Adult Swim. They want 60 seconds of handbags and lipstick for Instagram, portrait at 3, So all of everything with creative practice, and I mean, not to paint too bleak a picture, but it really does seem it's smaller and smaller smaller and smaller sections of content. And so anyway, even if you're doing installations, it's a new one every time, which it's exhausting, I guess. So my idea was like, it would happen kind of organically, is that each work feeds into a larger whole. Partly it's the world building, that it relates to this kind of this video essay I made called Sino-Futurism. So some of them are a bit more politically grounded, some of them are a bit more atmospheric and dreamy, some of them are shorter, some of them are longer. I think they all fit into a certain worldview that is, I don't know how to define it, but it is what I try and describe as this cinematic universe, which is interesting because of course cinematic universe is like a very commercial way of creating a collective art form, which is, let's say, the Marvel cinematic universe, right? and everything feeds into each other, and everything has its own IP and copyright protection, and it all makes sense because everything ties into each other. But I also feel it's interesting to think about that, not as just, commercial exploitation of intellectual property, but also as something that lets you have continuity over a long period of time. Because once you start feeding, as an artist who engages a lot with the internet, I see there's a lot of entropy in that system, and it also constantly wants to fragment into smaller and smaller parts, if that makes sense. So I think the idea of doing expansion packs for video games and so on, even though in the video games industry, it's completely a commercial decision about minimizing extra labor to produce more content and just, change the color, change the skin, reskinning this, 2019 edition, Call of Duty 17, exit from Russia, whatever it is. Like, there's a way of playing with these methods of distribution and reworking in a creative way.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. I want to read one more comment from the audience. The audience is commenting a lot. I haven't had a specific question come in yet, but Nick Suda says, these kinds of perspectives are so important now. So much art rooted in cyberpunk aesthetic is incredibly superficial and obsessed with the trivial elements of Gibson and Blade Runner. Centering the discussion around perverse utopia and neoliberalism is fucking important because this is the present we live in now, not the upcoming future. And so that's really nice to hear from someone who I encountered also in the tech world. And so, that's an old collaborator and colleague in the startup environment coming into this conversation space. So thanks for the comment, Nick. And if anyone else has questions, you can go ahead and enter them in the lounge. We're taking questions. And Zaiba, did you want to throw out anything else to Lawrence?
I guess I don't know, I had some notes about, I guess like a bit more maybe about sort of Farsight and this sort of like draconian kind of corporation that you've imagined in this universe. And so I just, I guess there's something that is obviously, playing with this idea of hindsight, and obviously you're playing with, riffing off that sort of like dynamic of like looking into the future, but also kind of, sort of referencing the past and this kind of like retro futuristic tone. I guess, I just wanted to maybe just, and obviously this is like you're weaving these different iterations of this corporation through these timelines that you're manufacturing. I just wanted, just kind of to learn maybe a bit more about this kind of like inspiration for Farsight.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so Farsight is a shitty Chinese copy of Google, and they're like, basically for my 2017 film, CGI film Geomancer, which is set in 2065, and basically 2065, the game is like the expansion pack for that film. And anyway, in the storyline, Farsight has created this, all-intelligent game-playing AI.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm always interested about is my own bias, right? So I thought after that film, hey, wouldn't it be funny if I've created this fictional world that in 2065, but it's like 2018 now. So I could actually, instead of being an artist and, whatever, creating stuff, what if I thought of myself as a Farsight employee sent back in the past in 2018 to fulfill this fictional world? So a couple of years ago, I incorporated Farsight Corporation in the UK, which is now my production company. So, I mean, it has all sorts of, whatever, like, reasons to do that. But the other thing is, now I realize, having met accountants and, found out about like business financing and stuff, that actually like the corporation, because it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. It's a very cyberpunk thing, human against corporation, human against machine. But actually, I realized that the corporation, which has its roots back in, maritime England, actually, which is to create, conglomerates to insure shipping vessels for colonial expansion and spice trade and tea trade and stuff. Like that's what a corporation is. A corporation, as I'm sure many people know, it's a non-human person which enjoys the legal rights of personhood, but cannot be subject to the same discipline or death or punishment, essentially, as a natural person, which is what it's called in the law. So Farsight, it's not just a way for me to, you know, fuck around with like criticizing this kind of thing. But I started seeing that the corporation, it's another way of seeing it is that an organism is like this collective entity governed by a group of shareholders and, you know, stakeholders and a board of trustees and all this stuff. That their role is to survive, to profit in a longer time span than any individual human being. Yeah. So another way of saying it's not too conspiracy theory. It's like a organism, or you could say virus if you want to call it like that. So it just made me realize that actually, like, I think a lot of my own, like, you know, bias, good versus evil and so on, it's not actually as simplistic as an evil Tyrell Corporation like in Blade Runner. It's not as evil as, what is it, Cyberdyne Systems in Terminator, right? It's kind of much more, it's much more weird than that. That's all I can say, you know? It's like, it's not as intentional, it's not as evil, it's almost accidental that these things got created and persist, you know? So, and for example, we might talk about the art world or the gaming industry, but again, it doesn't really exist. But at the same time, it has tendencies, it can have biases, it can, you know, like eat up smaller things, but it's like, it's much more uncanny than that, I thought. So anyway, Farsight is my way of looking at the dark side from inside somehow, you know?
Yeah, I think it's also, playing on that sort of addiction versus evolution, or then like addiction and evolution kind of coexisting. And that's kind of like the driving force behind like these kind of products that are, you know, that you've created. But yeah, thank you. That was really nice to hear some background info on
we do have another question from the audience, from the quiet listener. Are you a gamer? What virtual worlds inspire you in your studio work?
Yeah, I mean, gamer, like, to what degree? I think, I mean, I'm old enough to, like, you know, know the whole transition from, you know, console handheld gaming to, like, you know, whatever you might call it now. Most recently, with I learned how to play League of Legends, which was quite interesting, actually, over lockdown, because I had to, you know, spend time with my girlfriend over League of Legends, and that was the only way, basically. Wow. But like, apart from that, it's weird. I think, you know, when your work is gaming becomes work, right? So I don't see it. Sometimes I just play, but somehow it's like play gives me a form of guilt because it feels like work, and being a kind of workaholic anyway, it's even more problematic. So, like, for example, I don't know, it's kind of like, you know, when you study a bit of, I don't know, like film theory or something, you kind of see every film as like, okay, here's the climax. Okay, now this one's going to go bad and I know what happens. And oh, here's the twist. There's the twist. Okay, fine. So it's kind of like that with gaming, because to me, unfortunately, I mean, I'm not talking about independent indie experimental games. That's a different thing. But, you know, like, it is such a well-oiled machine to make you addicted and take away all your time and attention. So the difference with obviously console gaming is that the game has no intelligence or knowledge of your state of play. You know, they're just reacting to you, and hopefully you'll buy another game. Contemporary games, it's like you can't even play if you don't sign in, and they have complete information and about how long you played. They know exactly the right time to be like, hey, you haven't logged in 4 days. Why don't you get 100 gold coins? So the economics of gaming in general now is not my old school model of like, you pay $10, £10, you have the game for life. It's like a constant drip feed, subscription, addiction-based model, based on surveillance of your gaming habits, basically. And one of in Sino-Futurism, the video essay, one of the chapters was gaming and gambling, and I was looking at, you know, the which stems in my reading from the addiction brought about by the Opium War and the opium trade in East Asia and in China, basically, and in overseas Chinese communities. So as a critique of addiction, I am very susceptible to these, you know, the dopamine response when you get 100 coins, the clickbait that you get in games. So it's so interesting to observe, but I am so vulnerable as a slightly hyperactive person who likes clickbait to the mechanism. So I feel a guilt through playing. It's kind of interesting.
I think we can all kind of relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
No one is immune. Yeah.
And it was interesting when I showed 2065 in the show that Julia Kaginski curated in Soho in New York, the Forging the Gods show. And, you know, installing a game in an art context, especially some curators and, you know, writers were kind of hesitant to approach the piece. And so it was always this thing where I had to sort of offer to perform the piece. Like the gaming acuity becomes a real thing when you think about viewership of these kinds of works. And it's something I'm going to talk about towards the end of the day with La Turbo also, because they're now in MMO world in Fortnite, and that's a whole nother level. Like, yeah, I got to get on there, create an account, download the damn thing. It's huge. Buy an outfit, right? There's the monetization. So it's like all these entry points to be able to have access to some of these kinds of environments. But you know, it's fun then when you do get the controller in someone's hand. They'll sit there in front of the piece for a long time, and it is that exactly what you're talking about. That sense of like addiction, or that you can go deeper, you can keep going, you can get more, you get a response from it. So I think that's been really interesting. One last thing before we close out of this Q&A and hop over to the lounge. Some people were really excited about the soundtrack and the idea of getting the album. So just run us through how we can access that online, Lawrence.
So, I think just Google it.
Yeah.
So it's called Temple OST, and it's oh my God, here's the blurb. I was joking about blurb. So just Google Temple OST on the Vinyl Factory, and it's available as like a limited edition vinyl, nice custom artwork, or a digital download. And the soundtrack to my next, no, not my next film, but my film before that, the soundtrack's coming out, is out on a label called Hyperdub in a couple of months. So there's that as well. So yeah, I really appreciate people listening.
Super cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So we're going to wrap it up now. We're all going to hop on over to the festival lounges. Again, you can get there by the link under your live stream or up in the menu. Your badge code will work to get you in there, and we'll continue the conversation. And we'll be back after the break with Phase Zero. So thank you, Lawrence. Thank you,
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, everyone.